After the past 2 days, we've heard a lot about Hishakish Sawak and how everything is connected and everything is one, and how we must open and broaden our net and include others into our pool of resources so we can truly protect the resources that we're trying to protect and continue to prosper from those resources. One of the key themes of the FNFC is safeguarding habitat and responding to threats. Today, we'll explore this theme through a variety of presentations. To open, we have invited panelists for the discussion of First Nations-led emergency response to start the presentations. Please join me in welcoming Wayne Schnitzler, Executive Director of the First Nations Emergency Response Services Society. Wayne, please go ahead.
Great, thanks for having me today. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Sook people of the Okanagan today in West Bank First Nation. Yeah, when it comes to emergency response, as we've seen this season with the forest fires in regards to the planning and what needs to happen, it was very evident this year with the impact of the fires that we've seen this year that the need for planning emergencies and fuel management work, which FNFC does several things. We do fire services work, which is fire department work for First Nation communities. We also support people in emergency management, which is in the 4 pillars. And we also do forest fuel management work, which incorporates the mitigation process. And this is kind of where when I was thinking about this being brought to speak today when it comes to the Fisheries Council, I thought, when you look at the impact of the fires this year and, the effects of heavy rains and bringing landslides down into our waters, there's a real effect to the fish and the habitat and, our animals and the ecosystems. So one of the things that we're looking at is we do a lot of fuel management work around communities to protect them from wildfire. But the need to have that landscape management to protect the ecosystems and to do that work in partnership with other groups so that we can protect all the entities that affect First Nations, from hunting grounds to berries to medicines to, the animal habitat within the community. So that landscape management is one of the areas that our group is really focused on trying to get more funding to do and work around nations. Because as we know, the funding that we do get to do that protective work around nations is very limited to do the proper work that's needed to protect those communities. So as we've seen in these large-scale wildfires, is when they go through a landscape and leave behind such tremendous damage that the recovery process, which is underway right now, as you can see in OKIB, and then we've got other like Shaken and different areas that were affected. Linton, of course, was the first major fire of the season. And most of those communities are based or close to waterways. And so you can see the importance when we do look at the ecosystem and do our work planning around fire protection and emergency services response, that a lot of that hazard risk development that we do in communities, part of our emergency planning process as well, is to determine what the risks are to the communities. And I think it was great that we are starting to look at different values that are a danger within First Nation communities, because a lot of places have railways running through, lots of transport vehicles, highways. And then the other dangers that we have, of course, wildfire. And of course, with climate change, we're seeing those excessive rainstorms, 100-year storms happening every 5 years. And since I started in the fire service 40 years ago, but when I moved to the Okanagan, my first big impact fire was 2003 in Kelowna. And that's where I was on the incident command team at that time. And that's when you started to see these fires expand and start to be larger scale that really impacted. I mean, we lost many homes in the city of Kelowna that year. And of course, since 2003, we've seen these larger scale wildland seasons. I mean, 2017 and 2018, I was working for the fire commissioner's office, and those two fire seasons were probably the 2 largest fire seasons in the history of BC. And then, of course, rolling into 2021, what we've seen this year was just devastating fires and affecting a lot of communities and displacing people and of course, like you said, damaging the environment, as well as causing several issues that we're still dealing with recovery. So moving forward, I'd like to see, lots of, we got First Nations forestry councils, we've got, Fisheries Council. I think we all have to get together and start determining how we can come together to protect our lands and resources, in regards to natural disasters. Because as we see moving forward with climate change, and I mean, I was at the airport when that tornado went by. I didn't know it went by, but I seen it on Twitter and I couldn't believe it either. But I think this is kind of what we're seeing that's going to happen in the future. So I think it's so important that we start getting together as groups and starting to look at how we can be prepared to deal with emergencies, not only be prepared, but how to deal with them after the fact. Because that recovery process, I think, is one of the major issues that's lacking, because you can be displaced for years and damage to, the landscape can last for years and the effects can last for years. So in closing, I just wanted to kind of focus on the fact that one of the biggest things we need to do is determine our risk, then determine how we can effectively look after that risk, and then how we can respond to that risk in the future. But like I said, the biggest thing is for us to join together, because everyone has their expertise. And I think the more expertise we bring to the table from nations that can show the values and what we need to protect, and, the elders, the knowledge from the history and the past can all help us move forward in building those plans, which are totally effective for communities. Like you said, emergency planning is a very important piece in moving forward with First Nation communities, because without a plan and measuring our risks and what those risks are in our communities, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable to a large scale emergency. So in closing, that's where I want to leave it at. And thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you. Thanks, Wayne. I want to remind everybody, Slido's open, so make sure you put your questions into the Slido. Next, we're going to hear from the Nicola Watershed Governance Project, Brian Holmes, Leona Antoine, and Crystal McMaster. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Brian Holmes here from Spachman, the upper part of the Nicola Watershed. I'll just speak a little bit to our experience in the roller coaster that we've been experiencing over the last couple of years in terms of water concerns. This year was quite an exception, starting right out from freshet. Really minimal freshet for us this year. In terms of how that goes, the prior year was too much water. This year is not enough. But that was a domino effect on how we moved forward into the drier season. With minimal freshet, we started seeing indicators that we were kind of looking in a little bit of trouble quite early. And as things turned out, flow started dropping, and we were looking at maybe about a month earlier than we typically see water levels. So it really challenged us and kind of caught us unprepared in terms of what we'd established here in the Nicola, and that's the Nicola Drought Committee. We call it the Inkahip Committee, which is representatives from the local First Nations as well as the government personnel that are in charge of the water. So we've established that committee for about 2 years now, and have been learning and engaging on how to work together collaboratively on decision making. This year really put us to the test in terms of how we do that. So I'll go back a little bit to the experience. Back in June was quite surprising. A nice heat wave, a heat dome we experienced was created a bunch of scary scenarios in terms of water temperature. Low flows were already starting. So it snowballed from that down, increasing drought levels almost by the week. I think by the September came around, we were sitting here in the upper part of the watershed in drought level 5. So that really created concern about some of the spawning fish that were yet to come in the lower part of the watershed, and the landlocked fisheries as well in the headwaters. So what we saw was our base flow was basically nothing. In some areas, running into the rocks, talking to some of our elders and knowledge keepers. The last time they say they experienced that was back in the 50s and 60s. So it challenged us to work a little closer with the stakeholders, the water license holders. And through this INCAHEEP committee and working with the government and First Nations, we changed our approach on a more collaborative approach with the local stakeholders. One of them being the biggest license holder in the upper part was more of a collaboration and conversation with them. We asked the question, does a Section 88 work for you guys? And the comment was no, we would rather work with you rather than go down that route. So we ended up doing that, and we did achieve full withdrawal shutoff by August 30th. To our surprise, but not really surprise, it really didn't make a difference in terms of what we were seeing for flows. So it really brought to the conclusion, is legislation in that form really what we need to start addressing the problems that we're starting to see? So the good part about the relationship is the discussions we have and the decision making about what drought level we're going to and what measures are going to be taken. So part of that also included participation at the regional drought meetings, and bringing our voice and our concerns about not just as First Nations, but us as a community here in the Nicola, about what we were seeing and wanted in terms of direction and in terms of the province setting drought levels within the province. So there's a lot of information shared back and forth between regional, provincial, and First Nations. And it's been a good experience. I'm quite satisfied with the work we've done to date, and look forward to continue working with the province and their locals on this issue. In reality, what I see as the future is we don't have this drought committee anymore. I want to be a place where we don't need to have it. Leona, I'll let you finish.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'm Leona Antoine, and I'm the executive coordinator for the Nicola Watershed Governance Project. And it's a MOU between the provincial government and the 5 Nicola bands. And so over the past 2.5 years, there's been a number of relationships that have really gelled with stakeholders and government, and to truly know what it's like to be a decision maker for the provincial government and our communities. We also brought forward our own concerns and values, and we were able to use the Water Sustainability Act as a tool to bring forward some of the prevention and to be proactive. And so as we evolved throughout the relationships, we were able to bring more resources to the table and information of fisheries. And so DFO and other biologists in the community have come to the table to better inform the decision makers. So moving forward, we're able to reflect on some of the relationships and what we could be doing better with lessons learned. And so we're just in the middle of that evaluation right now. And what we're really starting to look at is other legislative tools that we could use with more teeth than the WSA because it is not reflective of our values. And so as we move forward, we'll be expanding the table, reviewing more of the legislation, and really it is 80% relationship building. And we were able to blanket it with some of our 4 food chiefs principles and the Intlakatma grandmothers principles. And as we evolve, we're hoping to incorporate our Indigenous laws that is moving forward in the coming years. So we have a lot of moving pieces, and actually feeling like our voice is recognized. With the recommendation of the level of drought is bumped up to the regional calls, and they are endorsing it. And we have our neighbors that are actually had gone into a Section 88 this year, so mandatory shutoff. And they're starting to really watch our process. And so we've been sharing some of the processes and relationships that we've had. It really is community-based and with the community knowledge. So moving forward, we're hoping to be able to have some of our thresholds built right into legislation and have the values reflected in the Section 88 orders. And so we see ourselves within. And there's been a lot of commitment. It's weekly calls and very, very reactive, but this committee has really been in the prevention mode soon as we went from freshet right into drought. So thank you, and we welcome questions later.
Awesome. Thank you so much. To conclude this panel, we're going to hear from Wendy Hawks, a biologist with Penticton Indian Band Natural Resources. Please go ahead, Wendy.
Whitehouse Isquisiatka Milkme Kel Nashnula Kikin. Good afternoon. My name's Wendy Hawks. I'm the Tamik biologist for the Penticton Indian Band, and today Milkmean Valley and Seal Territory. I was asked to speak with you about a project completed with ecosystem from the province. It was a top assessment post from the 2020 Christie Mountain wildfire, which about 2,000 hectares within the Sneksweef management area, which is just east of Skaha Lake. So when the approached, submitted a proposal with our traditional knowledge keepers. Part of the reason that is in our belief systems. These or Chaptik traditional laws, they tell us how to behave as human beings on the land and how to try to harmonize the other species that were the same places. So we're simply our chapter laws by our traditional ecological knowledge. So one of the did was meet on a regular basis to and what had happened. The source that PIB discussed severity, burning, how the land, everything that was interconnected. This area is uphill from literally thousands of homes, roads, parks, you name it, eastern side of Skaha Lake. So with and disparities that occur to determine the potential threats, they utilized the bighorn sheep, primary species of consideration. The reason for that, wildlife man is actually established in 2000, has done so with the rationale that habitat necessary to sustain these herds. Those are now threatened, and they're listed as threatened species within the South. They have suffered various diseases like Serapi's mite. The first group wanted to weigh the benefits, feasibility, recommendations they had government for the area, and most importantly, they were trying to assess the potential worst case scenario look like. Of course, there were costs to the sheep populations. If there were any severe weather, being uphill from most of these homes surrounding the lake, the potential for mudslides and debris was significantly. If those reach the lake, the sedimentation, the amount of sedimentation it could hit also supports our sand also be impacted. So understand and stressors get to this fire and the severity of the fire and the damage. There are other threats that the wildfire. There are many different tents that are currently allowed management area. So they needed to consider. Are also many of them are in the community and hereditary families. So and disseminate some of the information. Huge. It was welcomed by our knowledge keepers because share this within the community. And in the end, we really wanted to incorporate our own knowledge, our own mischief. It's an historical information that's down centuries and through the generations. So there's a huge amount of knowledge of history have occurred in the past, previous fires that have come through, and those impacted cats that provide were not horned sheep, but other species at risk in that area. I know that art on this land and with these ecosystem memorial knowledge has accumulated over the years. The more we can lean on and rely on it, the better informed and holistic we're planning out these projects, making efforts to land recover post-weather severe event, the landscape and subsequent populations that live on it. So I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to go to a Q&A right now, so please continue to put your questions into Slido. I know Wendy's having connection issues, but right now we have 2 questions. And can you elaborate on how you work with all stakeholders involved in emergency response, how those relationships developed, and why do you believe this is important to the implementation of emergency management for BC First Nations communities? And my assumption is that is for Wayne.
Basically, when it comes to emergency management in communities, one of the biggest areas is getting that stakeholder involvement from all the entities around the community and also neighboring municipalities, or if they're in agreements next door, because in the effects of a large scale wildfire, the importance of doing the planning and having the training to effectively be prepared for that emergency and also have that team built before an emergency happens is so critical in moving forward. And like I've heard from other speakers, there's so much more in emergency planning in First Nation communities and just looking like it's city plans on how they do it. We really have to look at our knowledge keepers. I mean, we're starting to talk about traditional burning as part of the preparedness part of preparing and using the traditional knowledge on where burning used to take place. So I think all of those aspects of emergency planning, including, traditional landscape, the type of animals and species that could be affected due to fires and emergencies, I think that overall all hazard planning needs to be more thoroughly done with talking to knowledge keepers and getting more people involved in the community.
All right. Thank you for that question. So this one's for Leona. Is she on it? Or Brian, can you maybe answer this? You mentioned having thresholds built into legislation. Could you please expand on this, which thresholds you're referring to? Critical flow thresholds? Thanks.
Yeah, we're hoping that our Indigenous laws will be able to help inform what thresholds we have to put forward. And so we actually had, the BC had 7 indicators that they often review for drought designation. And because of this committee and the relationships, they've actually added 2 more indicators on. And so, all that hard work is paying off, and really understanding who we are as Indigenous people and what our values are.
All right. Okay, I have a question, and this one I'm going to let anyone jump into. Is there more that we can do to collaborate across Indigenous organizations in times of crisis, such as Big Bar, Mount Polley, forest fires, drought, and heat waves?
Well, I can take a stab at that one. What we did this year is something really new. What we did is when the fires started, we actually established an EOC website. So First Nation communities could go on that site and see what communities were under either an alert or an order to leave. And then we actually attached mapping to show what affected areas were done, so that anyone from any First Nation community can go on and see the list of the different fires affecting distant areas, see the mapping. So it was a better way to communicate what was happening out there in an emergency. And it was our first go. We got lots of good feedback on that site and how it helped a lot of communities get up-to-date daily information, because we changed the information and kept it updated daily. So it really worked quite well, but I think we can probably improve it a little bit. But I think it's a good avenue to get information out. Our communication is really key to getting that info to all the communities.
Awesome. I have
can add
one
more to that, Michelle.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I can speak to Upper Nicola's experience. It really goes back to our Emergency Operations Center. Upper Nicola really dove into it because of the flooding we had. So it just transitioned into COVID plus fires. But it really came down to having people trained and kind of sharing that capacity or expertise with the other local communities that didn't have the opportunity to get those training. So having our people leave our EOC and head down and help those evacuees and get all those things sorted out was quite an essential and a collaborative process where the resources were being shared, our expertise were being shared to kind of get them going and get a little more organized, because where we were situated, we were kind of in the middle of everything in terms of the fires. So we weren't in too much, we had a little more flexibility on time and availability for people. But that's the challenge, is people trained. We actually have our very well trained ESS personnel on staff, which really helps us and takes some of that control back for us, and it makes it more comfortable for our community to be dealing with somebody that's from the community rather than trying to pull somebody from elsewhere.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Can you elaborate on the overlap between watershed security and your emergency situation and how the plan and process consider and take into account a healthy watershed? Don't anyone want to take a stab at that? If not, we can come back to a different question. I'll let you think about that
Can
one
take
for
a
a minute.
stab at it.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
In our case, for Pond, the post-fire flood erosion was the work that we carried out. And about that is following the Christie Mountain fire, we had the Thomas Creek burned in excess of, or approximately, much larger than the Christie Mountain fire. It came through and either reburned or burned more areas within the wildlife. So it overlapped the mountain fire. The importance of the work being done now for recovery is huge, because it's definitely going to take into your weather events and everyone living down at wildlife management.
All right. So we have two other questions. I can't see you, Wendy, so I wasn't certain if you're finished or not. I'm going to assume that you were. And do your plans include a recovery support component? And what does that look like for the watershed health?
Yeah, I can answer a little bit in terms of drought. I don't think we're quite there yet, and it's one of those understandings that we need to have together about what we're seeing, including Indigenous knowledge into that process and making that plan. I think we can all know we're in a situation where it's not looking great. So how do we fix that, or how do we make it better? How do we fix ourselves? Rather than trying to fix the water. The water will do what it needs to do. It's something else that needs to be fixed. So with the, I guess the discussion I had in terms of what we found after having full compliance with stakeholders, and it's still not making a difference. Right there, that tells you that legislation that we're using is reactive, and there's proactive things that need to be done, like water storage, all kinds of things that need a little bit more detail to be worked out.
Awesome. I have a question here. Might there be a study or consideration to the cumulative effects of fire retardant equipment and chemicals, etc., on water quality?
I can take a little stab at that. I think, in regards to BC Wildfire Service and the type of chemicals and retardant they use on these fires, I think it probably is a good study to see, move forward and see how that affects, because as you know, a lot of the fires are effectively being fought close to waterways, and of course with the retardant lines dropped, and then of course with rain events bringing retardant down into the streams, it probably is something that should be looked at and determined if that is a factor in fish health moving forward.
Thank you. All right. This is the last question I've got so far for this segment. So, how are elders or knowledge keepers involved in your process? How do you see this as an important part of aquatic habitat protection?
So their involvement is really that information gathering and having input about what it was like, or what the state was before what we're seeing now. Quite a bit different, or not much different. It depends on how you look at it. So it's key to involve our elders, our knowledge keepers, right at the beginning of the process. And over the last year and a little bit, we heard that message loud and clear when we were talking Chaptich with our nation elders. Don't just bring us in when you need a word translated. Involve us at the beginning, even if we're just sitting there. They need and want to be part of that process because it's part of our Analkan process, which is inclusive of everybody. And here's all those differing perspectives.
Just let me know we're back at 1:45. Andrea.
Thank you, guys, and thank you for all your responses. I want to thank everyone for their thoughts. We'll be back within 1 minute with our next presentation. Thank you so much. Pacific salmon are threatened by a suite of stressors, both known and unknown. Learning from Indigenous knowledge holders on the state and future of wild Pacific salmon, aquatic health, and culture. Up next, we have Dr. Andrea Reid, who is a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation and assistant professor with the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries. She is helping to launch and lead the Centre for Indigenous Fisheries, working to build a national and international hub for the study and protection of culturally significant fish and fisheries. Her research program adopts highly interdisciplinary and applied approaches to improving our understanding of the complex interrelationships between fish, people, and place. Dr. Andrea's PhD in biology centered on multiple stressor effects on Pacific salmon using tools and insights from Western and Indigenous science in tandem. Andrea is a co-founder of Riparian, a Canadian charity that connects young women with science on the water with the hope of growing the next generation of water protectors. Andrea, whenever you're ready.
Nit, Amwilla. Hi, everyone. How are you? It's so good to be here at the First Nations Fisheries Council Fall Assembly, and it's an honor to have been invited to come and to speak alongside so many that I know and highly respect in the space of Indigenous fisheries. As Michelle introduced, my name is Andrea Reid. Patrilineally, I'm Nisga'a, and matrilineally, I'm of Irish descent. And I join you now from the historical and contemporary territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. On my father, Patrick Stewart's side, we belong to the Killer Whale clan, the Giscast, following my Gigi Phyllis Stewart from Gingolth, right at the mouth of the Nass River. On my mother's side, Margaret Kane, I also come from a long line of seaside people, so it's in large part these pasts that drive my present. I'm now an assistant professor of Indigenous fisheries, as Michelle introduced, and I just ask that you bring up the slides now, if that works. At the University of British Columbia in the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, where I'm the principal investigator for our new Center for Indigenous Fisheries. And we're a new research, teaching, and outreach group centered on science that is for fish, people, and place. And we're all about community-centered approaches. All of our first projects are student-led and in partnership with nations and organizations here in the Lower Fraser, in the Great Lakes of North America, across Vancouver Island, and hopefully soon in the BC interior and up on the central and north coasts of British Columbia and into the Yukon. So I'm here today to share a short talk that stems from my PhD dissertation, which I completed last year at Carleton University in Ottawa, entitled Fish, People, Place, Interweaving Knowledges to Elucidate Pacific Salmon Fate. It's used the life cycle of salmon and the linked cycle of salmon knowledge systems as a conceptual framework, as a foundation that guided how I approached various assessments of the state of our freshwaters, the state of salmon knowledge and salmon systems and salmon knowledge systems, the effects of multiple stressors on salmon migrations, as well as the transformative potential of Etowuptimuk, or two-eyed seeing, which is defined as learning to see from both Indigenous and Western science lenses in tandem and in equitable parallel. And this was a highly interdisciplinary dissertation, bridging a number of different methodologies and techniques from fish biotelemetry, so tagging and tracking, interviews with knowledge keepers, as well as a ton of synthesis and review. And I'm not going to get into all of the details here, thank goodness. But I'll just note that my work on the state of freshwater systems and my review of Etowaptimuk were both published open access. So I welcome you to go check them out if you're curious to do so, which you can do so freely. And I also describe this latter chapter in full in a virtual seminar that I gave last year to my home department at UBC, which you can find on YouTube if you search Andrea Reid Two-Eyed Seeing. What I'll be focusing on in this talk is just one of these PhD chapters, which is soon to be published open access in the journal Facets in an upcoming special issue called Intersections of Biodiversity Conservation and Indigenous Health and Well-Being. This journal issue brings together authors from across Canada and some from around the world, sharing their own works at the intersection of these important topics. And my contribution to this, my small piece, is a project entitled Learning from Indigenous Knowledge Holders on the State and Future of Wild Pacific Salmon. This was my fifth thesis chapter, and this involved partnerships with many nations, namely Katzie, Lake Babine, Musqueam, Niska, Secwepemc, Statliam, Stalo, Silcotin, and Tsimshian. And this included 18 communities belonging to these 9 nations, spanning the Fraser, the Skeena, and the Nass Rivers, communities that I had the honor to visit in 2018 to speak with and learn from 48 community-identified knowledge keepers and elders. And I want to acknowledge that this doesn't and can't represent everyone, given the more than 200 nations in BC, but we developed partnerships in areas that myself and my collaborators had previously worked. So basing much of this, though not all, from existing relationships or network connections. We all know from the talks given in this forum and from our own lived experiences that salmon are in a really bad way and that the consequences of this are dire for our peoples, but way too little attention has been given to Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous science in the realm of salmon management. So what we aimed to do through this work is begin to change that and bring forward Indigenous experiences and expertise into the salmon literature in a respectful way that respects Indigenous knowledge systems, that doesn't treat the knowledge in a utilitarian or extractive way, that stems from relationships and that's positioned towards positive change in the long term. As everyone here, I'm sure, is well aware, in each of our own distinct contexts, we need the salmon for our survival as a distinct people. It is so connected into our lives that if the salmon disappears, so will we. We use the salmon for our rituals, food, and trade, and in return, we pay homage to the salmon. But across Northwestern, so-called North America, Indigenous knowledge is often drowned out, marginalized, and at times worse, forgotten. The acceptance of experiential place-based knowledges into fisheries management and policy has been largely precluded by Western scientific perceptions of this knowledge and its study as being unquantifiable, unreliable, non-systematic, and idealized. And these are the perceptions that we want to turn on their head through this work. So our goals here were twofold. The first was to characterize change in salmon catch over time from the perspectives and experiences of Indigenous knowledge holders, not outside folks. And was to identify leading threats driving salmon losses, or those that have the potential to. And again, this is from the perspectives and experiences of Indigenous knowledge holders and not outside folks, so kind of a pattern here. We also wanted to see how things varied by region and across BC's 3 largest salmon producing systems, which is why interviews took place on this broad scale. And doing this work well across so many different communities and contexts, as well as with collaborators from multiple universities, meant that there was a lot of protocol to be followed to get permission to do all of this work. And I'm not going to go through each piece here again, thank goodness, but a few highlights include developing research agreements with community to get express permission for this work and set mutual expectations from the outset. During our interviews, knowledge holders were welcomed to specify how they wish to retain control over their knowledge. For instance, indicating whether or not they would want to be contacted to review final reports and the like before they're shared. And then on the back end, with elders' consent, our team has shared or is in the process of doing so. We've encountered some slight delays due to COVID, but in the process of sharing audio recordings from this work and written transcripts for community access in the future where elders were inclined to give permission for that. So once that was all in place, I had an incredible privilege and a huge responsibility to travel all over BC to listen, to learn, to take notes. And on this one occasion, video record the entire interview with an elder who's very near and dear to me and to my family, Lavinia Clayton from Kincolith. I name her here as I can for many that I interviewed because many did not want to remain anonymous in this work. They wanted their names attached to the stories and knowledge that they were able to share with me for the purposes of this work. And for each interview, which took place on elders' terms and locations and at times of their choosing, I provided a small gift and honorarium as a token of appreciation. And I led this work during the sockeye return migration to freshwater, so I could be in the right places at the right times. And what this made really apparent was how well they're doing in places where smokehouses were filled to the brim like this, and how poorly they were faring in that same year in other places where salmon drying racks were empty the whole season long. And so what did I find through this work? First and foremost, no invited individual or community that I approached declined being involved in the work at hand, which I think is a big signal of how much people see a need for work of this nature. Also notable was that everyone agreed to being audio recorded. Sorry, a little delay there. And also in their communities, most wanted to share materials to be stored in archives, but there were a few exceptions here, which tended to be where tensions were high between hereditary and elected leadership, but archives reside with the elected chief and council. The next thing I'll highlight is that all began fishing from a really young age, on average age of 6, with "since I could walk" or an equivalent variant being the most common response. And on average, women had been engaged in salmon fishing for 52 years and men 57 years of their lives. So tell me that they're not salmon experts. 26 of them felt confident comparing catch rates over time from when they first got engaged in fishing to when they stopped or till the present day if they were still engaged in fishing. But there was an average decline of 83% over elders' lifetimes, which is a pretty sobering figure to be thinking about. That's like going from catching 200 salmon per week when they started out fishing to now only catching an average of 34 fish in a week. And some felt it far more steeply than that, and others less so, but this was what we saw on average. So what this looked like across regions and rivers, when we compared how modern catches stack up as a proportion against past catches, it's clear that modern proportions are low across reaches and rivers. On average, that like 17% of what it once was. And there's not a ton of difference between lower, middle, and upper river reaches, but some difference between rivers themselves, with the Fraser appearing to fare the worst with lower modern catch proportions than the Skeena or Nass, which doesn't come as a huge surprise. In terms of the driving forces behind these declines, I had elders select and rank their top 5 concerns from a predetermined list of threats. And these included a range of things in alphabetical order: aquaculture, as in salmon farms, climate change, commercial fisheries, contaminants, fisheries bycatch, hydropower projects, illegal fisheries, indigenous fisheries, industrial projects, infectious diseases, an other category, which they could select for all 5 of their top rankings if none of their main concerns were captured in what I presented. They kind of fell into 3 main bins, and those included capitalism, mismanagement, and predation, principally on the part of marine mammals, and then finally recreational fisheries. And what we found was that a few key concerns emerged as shared across regions and systems, with the top 5 being aquaculture, climate change, contaminants, industrial projects, and infectious diseases. Interestingly, there was a huge amount of localized variation that reflects the place-based nature of this knowledge and lived experience. So for instance, hydropower was only a top concern in the one area that I visited that had been transformed, with entire communities displaced and fisheries made to disappear due to a major hydroelectric complex. As another example, in the other category, predation was a leading concern in many coastal areas where proximity to marine mammals is clearly greater, and therefore awareness of expanding populations and mounting predation pressure on salmon is perceived or felt. Now, if we look at regions and rivers again, salmon farms carried the most weight among knowledge holders in lower regions. Contaminants were the leading concern in the middle, while climate change and industrial development, those were the biggest concerns tied to upper regions. And if we look on the bottom panel by river, knowledge holders placed the most weight on contaminants in the Fraser, on industrial development in the Skeena, and interestingly on salmon farms in the Nass, perhaps more out of concern for the unknown than the known, given that farms aren't in adjacent waters in the Nass system. But these conversations grew well beyond these core questions, and the plan now to do this work and the knowledge shared justice is to develop a book project in collaboration with some of those who are involved. And I'm just going to share a couple of examples in closing of emerging themes to give you a sense of where these conversations went. So while this wasn't something that I was explicitly looking into or expecting to hear through these conversations, the idea of once being able to drink the river kept coming up time and time again, with 35% of elders stating this very fact, even though I didn't ask a question about it, and lamenting how now they never could. As one elder said, "I remember the day I used to look in the Fraser River and see the fish going up. It was clear. We used to be able to go to the Fraser. We used to go down there and get a fill of the Fraser River water. Now when you look in the river, you can't even see 2 inches down." Another said, "I wouldn't even touch it now." And the story was much the same among knowledge holders in the Skeena, where one elder said that we can't drink the water because of the mine. Another said we can't drink Babine Lake because of the mining. We have to buy our water and it's getting costly. The relationship to water, to place, to fish is clearly changing as a result of these major threats that are present in our systems. And for many knowledge holders, the health of the water, the health of the salmon, and indeed the health of people are all one and the same. The salmon and the state of water were for many a connected memory, as in the words of the late Samagat Dr. Joseph Gosnell from the Niska Nation. He said, "That lake is not even a shadow of what it was when I first looked at it in the 1950s. If the north wind was blowing downriver and we were coming up, we could smell the salmon in the air. We could smell the salmon. You drink the river water and you can taste the salmon in the river. Wow." The hope for the future, the hope to return to a time and place where rivers can once again taste and smell of salmon and be drinkable and safe, that really rests with taking action now. Apologies, I did not carry that quote up soon enough. Equipping the next generation with the tools needed for the challenges we are facing and that are already baked in for the decades ahead. A need to shift away from productionist to regenerative modes of thinking across generational lines. So this is the work that lies ahead for me and for the center, to get our youth out on the land, learning about salmon and science in place on the water, and getting really excited about it. So hopefully, instead of leaving us in a place of despair about salmon, we can be hopeful in taking this first step in elevating Indigenous experiences and expertise in places from which they've been fiercely excluded, we can ready ourselves to uphold Indigenous rights and stand with our sisters and brothers who are also contending with environmental injustices and environmental racism, from the Mohawks of Akwesasne to Ojibwe nations in Chemical Valley and Grassy Narrows, to those exercising fishery rights on our east and west coasts from Mi'kma'ki to New Chalmette. We can be excited about engaging youth in these really important processes to be the next generation carrying the salmon forward. And so with that, I would like to say to Xanin, thank you to all the fishers, fisheries managers, fish processors, healers, historians, ceremonialists, spiritual leaders, caregivers, and advocates who made this work possible. Special thanks also to Nicole Marie Burton, who I commissioned for the illustrations that were included in this talk. And thanks to each of you, and I look forward to fielding some of your questions and comments. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrea, for the great presentation. And that last circle symbol reminded me of a life preserver, which reminded me of our discussion yesterday about salmon parks with the New Chalmette. And your discussion reminded me again about how important it is for us to understand Hishikish Sawak, everything is one and everything is connected, in order for us to save the salmon, save ourselves, and save the water. The floor is now open, and we have some time for some questions, and I've got a few lined up already. So what is your advice to First Nations communities to what to bring forward, that want to bring forward Indigenous knowledge to decision-making tables?
Yeah, it's a big question and a really important one. I think it's really key when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems, how we come to acquire and share that knowledge, that we think really critically around knowledge protection, and that we turn to the Indigenous data sovereignty movement and turn to tools like the First Nations Information Governance Center's principles around OCAP, data ownership, control, access, and possession. We need to be sure that when we bring our knowledge forward, that we're doing so in a way that doesn't carry greater risk for communities and for Indigenous peoples in this province and country. I think that that's a first really key step. A second, as I showed in our own processes for moving through this work, having really clearly well-defined agreements with those that we're working with that stipulate all of those mutual expectations from the beginning is really, really important. In terms of legitimizing Indigenous knowledge in those spaces, I think that's shared work that belongs to everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in these spaces, to recognize what Indigenous knowledge can bring to the table. So the onus is on everyone to be well educated about its value and what we can do to make space for it.
Thank you. How can your research help DFO understand how much we've been impacted by their management of salmon over time?
That's a great one. I'm on the front end of a new collaboration with a set of nations that focuses very much on this issue. So I will be able to provide a more full answer in the years ahead, but I think that it's really important that we begin thinking about how we can quantify some of these impacts so that we can show the evidence that they've occurred. The fact that, the loss of salmon is not just the loss of food, it is not replaceable with a grocery store, it is culture, it is language and tradition and practice and ceremony and all of these things that we know. And so we need to be able to capture and measure those impacts so that they can be accounted for in these systems, so that we can begin to not just assume that they're not there because we're not paying attention.
All right. I got a question from Howie. The research captures people who are still fishing and seeing the decline. However, a large portion of First Nations in the southern and headwater tributaries have lost their fisheries for a generation already.
Great question, Howie. Thanks. Most people were still active fishers or in recent history, but not all. So those that I spoke to about the change in their catch over time, that did reflect those that felt confident sharing that information. But there were individuals in the work who had no option but to not fish. And so it did catch a little bit of that variation, but I think that's a really important point that you raise and something that we need to think about for many locations, for many communities. that is a really important reality and probably do better justice in this work.
All right. I have, what tactics would you employ to ensure our standards are used in the management of salmon?
Sorry, can you bring that one up? I just missed the very beginning. My computer froze a little bit.
Oh, what tactics would you employ to ensure our standards are used in the management?
I mean, I think that it's very important that we have really well-defined standards and communicate them well. I believe that as you know, as I've heard kind of acknowledged in the context of this forum as one of the fastest growing populations in the country, I think Indigenous representation in decision-making spaces and in university contexts as researchers, that's going to continue to grow. And I think that that is going to really change a lot of the conversation being had here. But fundamentally, it's about holding everyone accountable. We know that legislative tools like UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, lay really good groundwork and a really good starting point for a lot of these conversations about the right to free, prior, and informed consent, the right to be at the decision-making table, the right to have say-so over what's happening in our territories or with our knowledge systems. But without a lot of work on our part to make sure that those become mutual expectations everywhere, we really need to advocate for them. There's perhaps too little attention being given into how we can uptake UNDRIP in meaningful ways. And so that's something I would like to see happen. And I think that that's a really important part of this conversation.
Excellent. This is another question, it looks like from Anonymous, how do you ensure that the Indigenous communities, nations you work with can benefit from the research process and the research outcomes?
Yeah, I like that question a lot. I think it's really important that we always talk about what these benefits look like. And so the nature of those research protocols are to spell those things out. But on a personal level, through this work, it meant being present in community and showing up in ways that are outside of the natural kind of range of research. With many of those that I worked with in this work, we went canoeing, I took elders to go get fish when they had trouble accessing vehicles. I meant kind of, being present at feasts and showing up in other kinds of ways. In terms of the benefits from the work itself, it's really critical that the work is shared back and that all researchers take up that responsibility of providing the outcomes of the work and sharing it in really accessible formats for all to learn from. It's community knowledge, and that knowledge remains and should remain within communities. So that is why that archival piece is really important, so that future youth, future community members can access these in the same ways. I'm a big proponent of benefits for youth, and so with some of the nations that I work with, we have youth camps that bring the research conversations into those spaces, and that's one of my favorite parts of this work. So I think it depends on a case-by-case basis, but it's a really important thing for us to be attentive to as researchers, managers, whatever our roles are.
All right. It looks like we're running down in time, so I am going to make an executive decision, and I'm going to ask, how can Western science make space for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, both in the context of research and decision-making?
Yeah, it's had massive primacy in all fisheries decision-making spaces. And so we need to recognize that that history is not just historical, it is present and ongoing, and we need to challenge the ways that we allow it to take up that space. The whole conceptual framework behind Etoweptimek, behind two-eyed seeing, is about how we shift power away from a strictly scientific, Western scientific lens, and making the space that's needed for Indigenous knowledge systems to stand as ways of knowing that are valid and whole and appropriate and informative in their own right. And so I think it's employing Indigenous conceptual frameworks. I think that is a really important way that we can get there. But it's really about rectifying power imbalances. So it needs to be about getting representation in those spaces and dismantling systems that have been exclusive in the past.
Excellent. And Anonymous must be thinking along the same lines of me. I noticed that part of your research is encouraging Indigenous women and Indigenous women's participation. And I've seen that the outcomes of your research, and I hope you put them into books that can be taught in our schools and primary schools and middle schools. So what are you or the center doing to recruit Indigenous students?
Great question. We're majority Indigenous now. We're small to begin, but we're thrilled that there are Indigenous students ready and equipped to do this work. I spend a ton of time with youth thinking about how we can make space for them in the research processes that we have underway now. But I think it's critically about making sure that we save space for that next generation, and that's something that we're really dedicated to in the center. And on YouTube, I give a multitude of talks that are often across North America in classrooms with Indigenous youth and non-Indigenous youth about the work. And so people can begin to see themselves in the shoes of scientists, even if they don't fit that conventional norm or assumption that people have in the back of their minds of having to be older white men to be scientists.
Awesome. I want to thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your insightful thoughts. We now will take a break and gather back in 15 minutes. During the break, we'll also stream a video about First Nations engagement in the Oceans Protection Plan. After we return, we'll dive right into the ocean-related issues with the Ocean Protection Plan and Marine Spatial Planning. Please stick around after these technical presentations as we conclude the day's session with the youth panel.
Imagine a time where all our people used to live along the river here. And when our hereditary chief that signed the treaty, one of them, this was his village.
All of our communities on Vancouver Island, Alert Bay, and some of our old village sites, they moved our people away from their historical villages. Indian Affairs did that. The government of this country did that.
This is where our people used to live, right here.
Well, how often can you break promises and come back to the table with leadership from First Nations, I think is the question. And not too often before people will walk.
The Oceans Protection Plan was launched in 2016 because there's a real recognition that, we can do more to protect our oceans and waterways.
The obligation of the federal government or the Crown at any scale, whether it's provincial or federal, is to consult with nations where there's a potential to infringe on their rights.
And so what we've seen over a period of, at least in my short time with fisheries in the last 11 years, is perhaps good resourcing, good intention, but it's very siloed. It's not as coordinated as we'd like. And so I think the government is doing the right thing by resourcing it, but it's too siloed and there needs to be more coordination to get good return on investment.
And by and large, what we're finding is we need to start building relationships and involving First Nations as partners.
Originally, when the Oceans Protection Plan was rolled out, each department was trying to do its own engagement. And what the result was is that the nations started to feel engagement fatigue, is what we call, when the nations are often invited to multiple meetings and trying to assess their own bench strength to participate in meetings. It's a challenge to actually have the capacity to participate.
Here in British Columbia, we have 204 First Nations, I believe. Well, that could lead to 204 different independent nations coming together to find solutions.
You have to have someone there that can listen to the voices of First Nations in government and be able to bring them together in a way that we can break some really good ground that has never been broken before. And it's, again, I talked about this before, it's going to be built on trust. So we need to establish good working relationships together and learn from each other.
All of our ancestors said the same thing. They took it away from us, our rights and title. Now we're slowly scrapping and getting it back. And it's been a fight.
I don't know that Transport Canada originally had a lot of experience engaging with First Nations. So some of the First Nations at their initial sessions indicated to the groups that were there that probably they should involve the Fisheries Council in the conversation.
I think one of the key part of our partnership with the First Nation Fisheries Council is designing an engagement approach or an approach to involving First Nation communities in the Oceans Protection Plan. How can it contribute to First Nation communities' interests and also the broader interests of protecting the oceans at large?
So the challenge is to look internally to government and how do we build a process that we understand the pressures of government, they have plans and priorities that they want to roll out, but we also understand First Nations and how they work and their needs, requirements, and kind of like their worldview.
Marine environment is our everything. It is the one thing that connects all of us together.
It's the First Nations that really are driving the conservation-based approach. And of course, we want harvest. We need to deliver on food security for our communities. But there's conservation. We need to maintain these fish as our ancestors have for the future.
The difficult thing that we're trying to shift the worldview on is to invest in First Nations early and often.
In March of 2019, after a bit of discussion, we concluded the commitment to actions and results, which sets out a framework for how we want to work together to engage and involve First Nations in the initiatives.
So the business model of the Fisheries Council in its simplest form is to convene First Nations, elicit what their interests and aspirations are. We distill that into meaningful information, whether it's discussion papers, whether it's position papers, and then we can provide that back to government. Oftentimes that cycle kind of repeats itself because now we've got an iterative process.
We've had differences of opinion and diverse interests and views, but we've always found that we are able to find a way forward. It has never stopped us in our partnership, and if anything, the different perspectives actually, builds us for a better outcome.
So I think that is the success. I don't think you can measure it in a scale of 1 to 10. I don't believe the end result is a certain number at the end of the day, but it's the ability of people to sit down and have conversations in a very respectful manner. That's the outcome.
Government needs to trust us, and we need to trust them. How does that occur? Well, we got to walk forward together. We can't walk behind them. We have to hold their hands to walk through the processes ourselves.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
What does it make you feel to be in a spot like this?
Well, it's like you're walking the footsteps of your ancestors.
Welcome back, everyone. You may know that First Nations Fisheries Council has worked closely with First Nations and Transport Canada to provide meaningful engagement opportunities to inform the Oceans Protection Plan. Now we will hear an update on the Oceans Protection Plan from the Regional Director of OPP Engagement with Transport Canada, Cecilia Lee. Then we'll go right into a panel presentation on marine spatial planning and hold a joint Q&A for both presentations. Right now, please welcome Cecilia Lee. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Hi, everyone. I'm Cecilia Lay. I'm the Regional Director of Transport Canada's Oceans Protection Plan Engagement. I'm really pleased to be joining you today virtually from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. This afternoon, I'll be providing you with an overview of the work that we've been undertaking with the Oceans Protection Plan in partnership with the First Nations Fisheries Council and our Indigenous partners. Next slide, please. So let me start by giving a very brief overview of the Oceans Protection Plan for those of you that are not as familiar with it, before I dive into sort of the couple more specific partnerships and initiatives that I want to highlight. The Oceans Protection Plan was launched in 2017 and has many, many different initiatives, and it spans 4 main pillars, including contributing to a safer marine transportation system through prevention and response measures, preserving and restoring our marine ecosystems, working in partnerships with Indigenous communities, and providing stronger evidence to inform decision-making. Now, the Oceans Protection Plan is a whole of government strategy that's led by 5 federal departments, including Transport Canada. But we know that the federal government can't do it alone, and that's why the program itself places very strong emphasis on working together with our partners, including forming new partnerships with Indigenous groups and other coastal communities. Next slide, please. So to date, Transport Canada has provided funding for 21 projects supporting ongoing Indigenous participation in the Oceans Protection Plan initiatives, or Canada's Marine Safety System. And this includes 6 partnership projects funded in the South Coast of BC until 2022. So in addition to our existing Indigenous partnerships, Transport Canada has also provided capacity funding through its Community Participation Funding Program, with a primary aim of supporting other types of engagement work that includes, for example, workshops, dialogue forums, committee meetings, and other specific activities. Let's take a look at some of the accomplishments that we have achieved through partnering with First Nations on these initiatives. Next slide, please. So let me introduce to you the Enhanced Maritime Situation Awareness, or what we call EMSA for short. I really think it's a great example of Oceans Protection Plan engagement in practice. And many of you may already actually be familiar with that platform, which was launched in May of 2019. Now, the EMSA prototype, which is a web-based geographic information system with over 7,500 distinct data layers, was created in partnership with 13 Indigenous pilot hosts from communities across Canada. It's an agile project, which means the system is being developed incrementally based primarily on the operational requirements and the ideas presented by our partners. Now, the EMSA partnership is built on trust and transparency, respecting Indigenous ownership, control, access, and possession, which we call OCAP. And so this helps to ensure that the Indigenous community has complete control over the knowledge that they share, if any, and under what circumstances. Now, EMSA currently has about 625 users across Canada, and approximately half of them are Indigenous users. Next slide, please. So let me dive a little bit more into our partnership with the First Nations Fisheries Council. We have been formally working together in the South Coast of BC since the signing of the Commitment to Action and Results Accord in 2018. Now, through this partnership agreement, FNFC and Canada, we've jointly committed to develop a collaborative and respectful working relationship, focusing on strengthening and supporting First Nations involvement in the implementation of the Oceans Protection Plan. With funding from the Indigenous and Local Communities Engagement Partnership Program, the FNFC, Transport Canada, and other OPP federal departments have worked together very closely with one another to implement the Oceans Protection Plan initiatives. And what we do is we convene, with the help of FNFC, South Coast First Nations through 3 coordinating committees. Now, these 3 coordinating committees focus on different thematic areas, and they include marine protection and science, ship movement and vessel management, and emergency preparedness and response. So improving upon previous engagement efforts, the FNFC and Transport Canada partnership has provided a number of engagement benefits to the South Coast of BC, and that includes FNFC as a convener of South Coast nations. And by dint of that, they have been a very valuable partner by bringing together a number of diverse First Nation communities across the region and supporting their collaboration in regional work. This partnership has streamlined engagement by bundling similar initiatives across multiple departments, and the idea is to reduce engagement fatigue and remove the siloed approach, by and large, to the federal department engagement. Now, through the coordinating committees, FNFC and Transport Canada have worked together to better understand shared interests among the participating South Coast First Nations, trying to prioritize the work that's most relevant to First Nation communities. The primary initiatives of focus for each coordinating committee was determined by participating South Coast First Nations. And Transport Canada and FNFC have also worked together very closely to ensure that the oceans protection related updates, policies, programs, and other information of significance is communicated broadly through the South Coast region. And this has provided a number of valuable efficiencies for Oceans Protection Plan initiative teams that have limited resource capacity. Next slide, please. And so now let me come to this specific initiative that I wanted to highlight for you today. The Cumulative Effects of Marine Shipping, or CEMS initiative, is really a great example of our partnership with the FNFC. Cumulative Effects of Shipping initiative is a national initiative. It was launched in 2017. The focused engagement work on the South Coast of BC began in late 2019. Now, last year, Transport Canada's CEMS team provided an overview presentation at this annual General Assembly, and so some of you might have already had a flavor of what it is about. And actually, a lot of considerable work has been accomplished since then. And some of you may be aware that the purpose of the CEMS initiative is to establish a shared, co-developed approach to better understand coastal ecosystems and the potential effects of regional marine shipping activities on the environment and the people surrounding it. Now, the CEMS pilot project in the South Coast of BC has been guided and supported by a multi-layer assessment approach that addresses cumulative effects needs of South Coast nations at different scales. Now, Transport Canada has been undertaking a regional assessment by working collaboratively with the FNFC to support the collective CEMS work with South Coast First Nations through the Ship Movement and Vessel Management Coordinating Committee, the VMCC, under our partnership with the FNFC. Parallel to the regional work is the sub-regional work, where Transport Canada has been working to support more localized priorities with nations and groups of nations that have indicated an interest in working with one another. Now, both of these assessment processes have been supported by ongoing bilateral discussions and collaborations with South Coast nations. Next slide, please. Now, Transport Canada's collaborative work with the FNFC and the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee has resulted in a number of significant milestones and achievements. For example, last year, we shared that in the fall of 2020, Transport Canada, FNFC, and the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee co-developed an evergreen terms of reference document, which is known as the Living Work Plan. The Living Work Plan sets out how Transport Canada, FNFC, and the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee will collaboratively work with one another to implement the regional CEMS initiative in the South Coast of BC. Now, in the spring of 2021, the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee worked through this initial scoping phase of the project, outlining the Living Work Plan, by developing an inventory of and impacts that contribute to the cumulative effects of marine shipping. And furthermore, in 2021, the Vessel Management Committee identified scoping criteria to further refine the regional assessment. Now, looking ahead for the rest of the year, Transport Canada will continue to work with the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee to use the results of the summer survey work to determine the final scope of assessment, which will be implemented in accordance with the steps identified in the agreed Living Work Plan. Next slide, please. So throughout the CEMS working experience, Transport Canada and the FNFC have jointly developed a number of lessons learned in how to engage with the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee and South Coast First Nations. These lessons have not only been useful for advancing the CEMS initiatives, but they've also been beneficial to other work that are being conducted by the Marine Research and Science Coordinating Committee. For example, Department of Fisheries and Oceans Marine Spatial Planning work, which you which you'll hear about a little bit later. So, for starter, one of the lessons learned is that we've learned is that it's imperative that established relationships and partnerships are built on open two-way dialogue that's designed to build trust. Now, this process with the SEMS initiative is based on mutual respect, and it's a reflection of one of the call to actions.
Hi, everyone. We're experiencing some more technical difficulties. I wonder what's going on outside, that the weather's trying to show us something by cutting off all the internet today. We'll just take a quick second to figure out if we can get Cecilia back on, and if not, we'll go into our next panel, as I do know that they're standing by. So we'll give it a second here, and if I don't see any significant change in 28 seconds with her status, we'll go into the panel and then perhaps come back to Cecilia. How's that sound? Thank you, Cecilia. I know that you've got a PowerPoint and we will share it with our guests here today. We can't bring her back up, so we'll just have to carry on. So we'll now proceed with the presentation on marine spatial planning. Please stay until the end of this presentation to ask your questions to the speakers and tune in for the upcoming youth panel presentation. Right now, please welcome June Rifkin, Regional Manager, Marine Spatial Planning with DFO, Charlie Short, Executive Director, Regional Operations with the Province of British Columbia, and Eric Engel, Uathuk, Fisheries Program Manager with the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. Each will do a 5-minute presentation, and we're going to start with Eric, then go to Charlie and June. Eric, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks to the FNFC for this opportunity. It's been a great 3 afternoons worth of sessions, I must say. I've been following as much as I can, and it's been really well done. So thank you guys for that, and congratulations. I'm the Fisheries Program Manager for Uathuk, and I'm based here in the Hauthi of Sishat and Hupachasset. And I'll be quickly just going over some of the work that we've been doing to help support our nations here at Uathuk in the area of marine spatial planning. So we did a lot of work around 10 years ago towards something resembling marine spatial planning. We gathered a lot of information and knowledge around what's in the marine environment and mapping that information so that it was accessible. And then it didn't actually turn into a full-on marine spatial planning exercise for a variety of reasons. But we worked through a regional co-management body called West Coast Aquatic, and there was a lot of funding provided for that through environmental orgs. And just recently, we're seeing a renewed interest in marine spatial planning on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and Transport Canada, DFO, federal agencies are all expressing interest, as well as the province. And there's a recognition here at the Tribal Council in Uathuk and amongst the nations that we need to be ready to engage on that in a way that really looks after the interests and the values of the nations. So we see a couple, some opportunities here and some dangers. The opportunity really, this is a changed environment even from 10 years ago, and there's really a chance here for effective recognition of First Nations authority and decision-making ability. And we're really pushing hard on that for government to government, nation to nation relationships on anything to do with what's going on in the marine environment. The danger, and I think we got a sense of that from the presentation yesterday afternoon on cumulative effects in Blueberry River, is that industries and government agencies with more resources and deeper pockets will use a process like this to dominate what the decision making is and what kinds of information get gathered, and ultimately what goes on in the marine environment. So we have to just be mindful of that and make sure that doesn't happen. So we've done a few things over the last couple of years to help prepare ourselves and the nations for the marine spatial planning exercise as it's framed by government. One of those is we looked at marine protected areas. Those are an important tool, and not everyone necessarily agrees with those, but we felt it important to understand from an Indigenous perspective how to prepare for them, how to implement them, how to make them work for the nation. So we hosted a workshop on Indigenous co-governance of marine protected areas, and we collaborated with other nations, North Island, Central Coast, North Coast, and produced a report out of that, a really detailed kind of report, a technical toolkit on how to do Indigenous co-governance when it comes to marine protected areas. Another thing we did was we we reached out and worked out an agreement with HIDA to set up something called the Oceans Dialogue Forum, where we've got a lot of issues in common that we recognize, and in particular with respect to the marine spatial planning kind of topic, we recognize that HIDA have done a great deal of work in this over the years and have a lot of expertise. This is an opportunity to learn from them. So we've been meeting regularly at both a technical and a leadership level with HIDA, and we've brought other nations from the coast into this. And this is just the nations. We're not engaging through this process with government agencies. We're working as nations together to support each other. Third area that we're doing is really focusing in on our laws and our governance. So we partnered with West Coast Environmental Law to do a project to document and bring forth and hold up our salmon laws so that we can manage our salmon fisheries in keeping with the laws and the authority of the Hapia, the hereditary leaders. And we're doing that with 6 of our nations in Clayoquot Sound and Nootka Sound, and we hope that it becomes a foundation for a broader application and implementation of Nuu-chah-nulth laws and a real recognition of the authority of the Hapia. And then two more pieces. I see I'm down to a minute here. We've got a watersheds project, salmon watersheds research project we're doing in collaboration with SFU, and that's allowing us to look at cumulative effects on salmon in the marine and terrestrial environments. And that's very important for understanding this kind of methodology of what are all the effects that build up over time from lots of different sources. We're starting with an Nuu-chah-nulth perspective, and then we're bringing non-Indigenous experts into the conversation. And then lastly, we've been working with Transport Canada around 2 initiatives, and Cecilia was talking about a couple of those. One of them is the CEMS, the Cumulative Effects of Marine Shipping. I have to say I've been really impressed with the nature of the collaboration with Transport on that project. They've been very flexible. And the other one is Places of Refuge, which is really quite critical, and seeing what's happening with this container ship incident, certainly timely. So if I can just have 2 more seconds, I'll just hit a couple of key lessons here. Get governance right as a priority. Collaborate and learn from others, and beware of the processes if they're favoring the participants with deeper pockets, and push hard on your own strengths, which is really the ability to see all the interconnections, which government agencies struggle at, and Indigenous groups we excel in doing that. Thank you. Clerko.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is June Rifkin. I'm a regional manager with the Oceans program at DFO. Joining you today virtually from my home in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Really pleased to be on this panel together with Charlie and Eric and Cecilia when she joins us again. And also wanted to express gratitude to the FNFC for providing the space and coordination to talk about marine spatial planning. So I have 2 slides for you, and then I'll pass it over to Charlie, who'll be following me with a couple of slides as well. So what I wanted to do in our short time today is just to introduce this Southern BC MSP program. Some of you might have some familiarity with it, but as Eric mentioned as well in his presentation earlier, it is a newer program area, and there is some interest in it is a program area that's new for the federal government, for which DFO is the federal lead. So I thought I'd introduce a few bits of information here and there so you get a bit of a sense of what it is, and then tell you about some recent collaborative work that we have underway together with the FNFC's Marine Research and Science Coordinating Committee, which you heard Cecilia mention earlier, and together with the province of BC. So just to sort of kick it off, as you can see in the map on your right, this is the sort of starting point for a preliminary area, planning area, and it includes the southern shelf marine bioregion in sort of that light purple, as well as the Strait of Georgia. And so what is it that we're doing with this marine spatial planning effort? And so it's essentially a process, collaborative, and we're looking at how we coordinate and allocate activities and uses within this planning area to achieve ecological, economic, social, and cultural objectives. So that's just a broad, high-level definition. I'll tell you a little bit in the next slide on where we are at in this process, which is quite early on. And in this marine spatial planning process, we are bringing together federal government, provincial governments, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous organizations like the FNFC, and then as stakeholders and eventually the public as well. And so next slide. Okay, so then as I just mentioned, really this is a process with many, many phases. It can take many, many years for those of you who have had experience to spatial planning processes, whether in the marine or land environment. In the top of that schematic on your right, you can see that the current status, so where we're at in the Southern BC work is very early on. We are doing work that cuts across phases 1 to 3. When you look ahead to some of the descriptions in terms of phases 4 to 6, those are the phases that start to get into actual spatial planning, creating a plan, finalizing a plan, implementing and eventually monitoring and whatnot. So those are many, many phases away. We are very focused on taking our time to really gather information, coordinate ourselves, get ready, understand priorities and interests and values in this process. And a lot of this work has been undertaken through our work with the FNFC's Marine Research and Science Coordinating Committee. So in the summer of 2020, we came together with that committee and held a sort of kickoff workshop to introduce this program in its early days and start to hear from the committee in terms of what's important to you, how should this new program be approached. And we've taken a lot of that information to heart in terms of how the next steps have sort of proceeded. And so really the focus over the past while as this program is sort of evolving has been very much to take our time to really understand interests. We've heard up front the importance of considering and thinking about trilateral governance. And so we have a draft letter of understanding, which is a letter that describes the work that the three parties in terms of DFO, the FNFC, and the province will do together, the manner in which, the principles and manners in which we'll work together, and the types of things that we'll be working on. And so some of those efforts are underway, including that draft letter of understanding. And we will continue to work with the committee, the members of the MRSCC, and together with the province, and plan towards future work planning and workshops coming into this winter. Now I see that I'm almost out of time. The 5 minutes goes really quickly. So just wanted to point you to the box on your left on your slide. So just again, so you have a sense of some of the early work in this information sort of foundation building stage. Some of it is to just gather what we know. So that the Marine Atlas is a starting point to gather existing publicly available federal and provincial data. It's just a basis from which to build upon. Trilateral governance recommendations. So this is an area of thinking that we are in early stages of working with FNFC and the BC on. And as I mentioned, we do have this letter of understanding, which we are looking to continue to advance and finalize. And then lastly, just one last point, and I'll pass it over to Charlie. As you can see from the schematic on your right, we are not into spatial planning phases. And so really the focus based on the interest we've heard thus far is on building the foundation, starting with a framework so that we can get ourselves coordinated, create the building blocks, and create a path so that we can use that to inform future planning phases. So I will pass it over to Charlie. Sorry for going slightly over.
Great, June, and thanks, Cecilia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Charlie Short. I'm an exec director with the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Office, and Rural Development with the province of BC. And particularly, I work predominantly in the coastal area and on related matters, more specifically. I am attending here this afternoon territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation, and so thank you very much for having me. So what I thought that just in the time remaining here was just talk a little bit about where marine spatial planning can lead you in the future. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. And I specifically wanted to talk about some of the general benefits of working working together, establishing an overarching framework around how people will work together towards a particular end. And so some of the things that June just said, and as well as Eric, were really important because laying that foundation around governance, having that shared, integrating knowledge and information, as it gets you to I would say those two things are crucial. Gets you to a place to embark on quite a lengthy process basis. And so I've had the privilege of working with many nations in the northern part of the province on marine spatial planning, and I just wanted to share a bit of some of the lessons learned and things we gained out of establishing those particular things, governance arrangements and fundamental knowledge sets to then advance to spatial plans at the end of the day. And so this sort of lists out a few bullets where we've seen benefits of coming together and articulating a shared vision around how people ought to be using our coastal environments. And so I won't go through them all just in the essence of time. We have seen a lot of conflict easement solution, so to speak, or of potential conflict altogether. Sort of a more, if you flip it around, more increased compatibility understanding of how this should be used. Seen enhanced stewardship activities. We've seen more sustainable economic development ventures occur, and then generally have increased our work more together. And we're also able to kind of collectively identify and draw parallels and linkages between the multiple policy initiatives and strategies and projects that people are working on in the coastal and marine environment. And these are similar to what other jurisdictions have been seeing as well. So next slide, please. So you can see these things at different scales. In the north, where we have a set of plans that occupy the space between Campbell River and Alaska, we've seen a lot of interest implementation benefits result at that particular. And one is I just sort of mentioned governance and knowledge transfer, as well as larger scale phenomena like climate change effects, performance monitoring, in cases marine protected network design, and geographic response capacities. And please, and this is just a sample of some of the things that we've witnessed over the years of implementation.
Thank you for that. And I think we're going to go back to Cecilia for her last two slides. So we'll take a couple minutes and finish off with her. And then right now, start entering your questions into Slido, and we will go into a panel discussion shortly thereafter, Cecilia. Cecilia?
Thanks very much, Michelle. I'm sorry about that little glitch, but I do think that we are on to the best part of the presentation. I will be very quick. So I'm on this slide on partnerships lessons learned. So really the key things that we've done in partnership with the FNFC are many. I would just highlight some here. For example, we've learned that we really need open two-way dialogue that's designed to build trust. The process with the SEMS initiative is really built on, based on mutual respect, and it's a reflection of the principles that we've agreed to abide by in terms of our working relationship. Another guiding principle that we stick to is flexibility, and it's intentionally embedded in the SEMS process. A great example of this is, despite the impacts of COVID in the last few years, Transport Canada and FNFC project team have been able to adapt really nimbly in these challenging times and continue to move the initiative forward. Now, both the Transport Canada SEMS and FNFC teams are pretty small in size and with limited capacity. And so this places a huge emphasis on the need to be as efficient as possible with our project resources, and also to actively coordinate activities across various projects. Coordination does require effort. What it means is regular and frequent communication. But as the SEMS experience show us, investing time in coordination can really provide efficiency and implementation benefits to the project as a whole. So the SEMS Living Work Plan was designed to allow for space between workshops for the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee members to discuss and receive feedback from community leadership, knowledge holders, and community members to inform the initiative moving forward. Now, the inclusion of community input in the SEMS process has really ensured that the project and the deliverables are relevant to the needs of the Vessel Management Coordinating Committee members, as well as the values and interests of their respective communities. Final slide. We really look forward to continue to work with the FNFC and all our Indigenous partners to build upon the successes that we've had so far under the Oceans Protection Plan and also the lessons that we've learned today. So thank you very much, FNFC, for allowing me this opportunity to share with you today. And thank you very much for your time and your patience.
Thank you for your presentations. The presenters are now ready for your questions. Please write your question to the speakers in the Slido box. And I see we already have a couple questions. So, Cecilia, how is Transport Canada implementing UNDRIP within its OPP work with First Nations in British Columbia?
Sorry, I was just struggling with the mute button there. So it's absolutely important. The UNDRIP legislation came to pass not very long ago. We are actually very much like we've engaged in passing the act, engaged with national Indigenous organizations, but also our Indigenous partners and others to make sure that we can do it right. Now, the UNDRIP itself, has a number of 46 articles describing the individual and collective rights, but they don't prescribe on how we implement the rights. And that's why it's important to work with our partners to really hear from them how it is that, we breathe life into UNDRIP.
All right. Charlie, you're on the hot seat. How will the province align provincial coastal strategy activities with the marine spatial planning work?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I think we would reflect in strategy that has yet to be developed there across the province. So if marine spatial is a priority that people want to see fulfilled, then my view is that should be reflected in the strategy as we move forward. The strategy will certainly more high because it's coast wide, so it's going to be a little bit flexible with regards to what's happening, what's working well, and what hasn't happened in certain priorities are.
All right, I'm going to go to Eric just to see if he has anything to add to any of these others from a First Nations perspective, or specifically Uathuk.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thanks, Michelle. No, it was really interesting to hear the presentations from the other agencies, and I think what we're looking for from our nation's perspective more than anything is a really noticeable break from the status quo. We still find that a lot of initiatives get rolled out fully formed without prior discussion with our nations on what priorities are. We see a lot of talk around improved relationships, but the proof of it is still hard to find. And marine spatial planning is an exercise that could bring a lot of benefits to all the parties that are engaged in it, but it also has the potential to lead to a lot of mistrust if the process isn't followed through honorably. So I guess what we would say to our government partners is really to take seriously the opportunity that we've got right now at this moment in our collective history to work in good faith and to really put the resources into these processes that are needed.
All right, thanks, Eric. I got one last question up here from Megan. Cecilia, can you explain more about the flexible project planning and the development? I hope you've seen the question because I missed it. Oh, there we go. And the development you mentioned as a learning from CEMS. How do you begin a collaborative approach here for the effective co-development of a project?
Well, I have to say a lot of it comes from the FNFC, and I think that's like really one of the most important values that FNFC brings, because they advise us on how best to approach it. I think, when you talk about flexibility, you can kind of see it, like, for example, in that cumulative effects of marine shipping project. We have not what is called just, a document, but a living document. The idea is that it needs to be evergreen, and we may not have it completely right from the beginning, but we continue to improve it based on our experience, learning by doing, and so forth. And so I think the living document is actually really emblematic of the flexibility we built. For example, another example is, I understand that, originally we wanted to kind of look at sort of a more regional cumulative effects of marine shipping. But what nations come back to us and are saying is, well, actually, we want to know the local stuff too. There are certain local issues that are specific to our nation or to our neighbors, but may not apply in other areas. And so when you only look at a regional project, you're going to miss all these important details. And so I think from that perspective, the team has been has really listened very hard and say, okay, what can we change to kind of be inclusive and actually make it even a better project. And so I think what we found is that when we listen to each other and actually work together on kind of, on the basis that, well, things will change, that we may not have it sort of kind of set out from the beginning, and being open to those kind of ideas and actually really working together and trusting each other, that's gone a huge way to kind of making this project, really successful thus far. So.
All right, I have one final question. What is DFO doing to break down silos between government departments that have overlapping or linked mandates?
Sure, I guess I can jump in there. Thanks for the question. Well, I'd say that marine spatial planning, to use Eric's word, is an opportunity to do exactly that, to break down the silos. And so along the same sort of theme of really taking the time to understand the lay of the land, not jump ahead into spatial planning, gather the information, really understand the contextual landscape of the Southwest Planning Area. We have been working to really inventory, sort of take stock, like what is it that's happening in terms of federal programs and initiatives, provincial programs and initiatives. We had a question today about the Coastal Marine Strategy, for example, Indigenous-led efforts, Indigenous-led marine use planning in traditional territories, and so forth. So quite a lot of effort is placed on exactly that, on what do we understand, what is happening in this planning area, how do they link together, what is sort of the crosswalk between all of these initiatives. And one of the key takeaways that we took in some of the early work that we've had with the FNFC's Marine Research and Science Coordinating Committee is to look for efficiencies. And so to break down those silos, we're really looking at ways to collaborate with other related initiatives in any of these early areas of foundational building. So for example, just to highlight the SEMS initiative, or the cumulative effects of marine shipping that you heard Cecilia speak to, we are working jointly with our colleagues in SEMS and Transport and OPP and the FNFC to look at, well, what are some ways where we can better understand how the initiatives link? Are there opportunities to jointly advance any aspects of our work? What can we do to not create yet another layer, but work together efficiently and ensure that all of the different moving pieces, whether it's knowledge, science, data, traditional knowledge, governance, all aspects of engagement, what can we do to make sure that we're gathering all of that together to inform the foundation, so that as we start to think ahead into spatial planning phases, we are understanding what is happening, we are making those connections, we are looking for efficiencies, and we're finding ways to work together.
Thank you all for your contributions to the discussion. We're now handing it over to the youth panel with Kim Carrier and Jenna Duncan from the FNFC. Over to you guys, girls.
Hi. Before we begin, we wanted to take a moment to recognize that we are currently streaming from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We also wanted to recognize and honor the Indigenous people of these lands and across the world, and thank you for the important work of protecting, respecting, and upholding our sacred relations with water, the natural world, and all of our relations. This afternoon, we are gathered here to show off the amazing work of our inspiring youth panel. My name is Jenna Duncan, and I will be co-moderating the panel this afternoon. I am originally from Whitehorse, Yukon, and I'm a member of the Taonquitchin Council First Nation. My nation gets its name from water, being people of the lake, and ever since I can remember, I've always had a close connection with water and all the species that live there. I moved to the Lower Mainland to complete my Bachelor of Science in Biology, and I started working for the Fisheries Council as a project coordinator in January of 2021. And I work mostly on supporting the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund. And this afternoon, my co-moderator is Kimbaya Carrier, so I'll pass it over to Kim.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kimbaya Carrier. I'm originally from Treaty 1, Winnipeg, Manitoba. From my dad's side of the family, I'm Franco-Michif, and through my mom's side of the family, I am of Mestiza Mexican heritage. The water and the ocean have always been a big interest of mine, especially as it relates to one's own culture. I graduated with a biology and environmental science degree back in April 2020 from the University of Winnipeg and started working with the FNFC as the Water for Fish project coordinator. Before we get started, I wanted to talk about a project that me and Jenna have been working on. As Indigenous youth ourselves, we've started to develop an Indigenous awareness training module. The FNFC is made up of a multicultural staff, and in the past year, we've had an influx of new staff. This is why we've decided to develop this training module to ensure that the FNFC staff have access to quality training resources and ensure that we're all well informed when working with the various Indigenous communities here in BC. We both believe this is extremely important part of the work we all do. And I wanted to start off by introducing Caitlin Cooper. She is from the Tsimshian Nation. She completed her Bachelor's of Natural Resource Protection at the Vancouver Island University and is currently pursuing her Master's in Natural Resource and Environmental Studies at the University of Northern British Columbia. Her work is centered on Ulikin.
Our next panelist will be Casey Sterling. She is Niklekmak, Mi'kmaq, Métis, and Acadian, and is a status member of the Lower Nicola Indian Band in Merritt, BC. She's from Williams Lake, the traditional territory of the Williams Lake First Nation. Throughout her life, she has walked between two worlds, Western and academic science and Indigenous traditional knowledge. She received her Bachelor of Science from the Simon Fraser University before entering into graduate school at the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries new Center for Indigenous Fisheries as a master's student, learning from Dr. Andrea Reid. She holds a Chartered Herbalist Diploma for Dominion Herbal College as a complement to the many teachings of plants gifted to her by elders throughout her life. Casey sees it as both a pleasure and a responsibility being an Indigenous researcher trained in biochemistry research to bring a perspective to Enuaptimak, which is two-eyed seeing, as described by Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall, to fisheries science.
And last but not least, I want to introduce Latia Northwest. She is from the Samson Cree Nation and is working to complete an environmental and conservation science degree, as well as a native studies degree at the University of Alberta. While attending university, she sits on the Samson Cree Nation NEPI Water Committee as the youth rep. She is also a teacher's assistant for the Cree language course at the university. So welcome everyone, and we'll pass it over to Caitlin Cooper to start us off.
Hi there, my name is Caitlin Cooper. I'm from the Gitwal-Gyats tribe out of Lac Lams. I come from the people of the Kelp. I'm currently doing my Master of Science at UNBC, and my thesis will be based on Ulikin in the Haisla Territory. So I'll be doing a traditional knowledge study, and I'm still in the beginning of my process, so I'm looking at finding a way to do a traditional knowledge study, but also do a Western science approach to learning more about Ulikin. And I applied to this research group called CARU, which is Conservation Research on Ulakan in the Haisla Territory, and I was one of 6 candidates that was chosen to be a part of this research. So we'll be going down to Kumano in February and March to study Ulakan. I've been working with Ulakan in the Skeena watershed for the last 3 years. So I've been working with North Coast Skeena First Nation Stewardship Society, and I've been doing harvest monitoring with them, and also getting to talk to other nations on the river about what they love about Ulakan. And there's multiple people doing lots of studies. So hopefully one day we'll all collectively have some Ulakan working group. And I guess just to talk a bit about my work history. So I'm from Lac Whillams. I'm from the North Coast. I've been working in salmon fisheries for the last 4 years. So I've worked for my nation and then moved on to North Coast Skeena, and some of my highlight projects would have to be the chum radio tagging project. I worked on that for 2 seasons. So we radio tag chum salmon and then basically trying to identify critical spawning habitat. They're not well understood in the Skeena estuary. I've also worked on the recreational fisheries monitoring program and kind of dabble in a little bit of everything. I've done some habitat restoration through North Coast Skeena as well, which has been really kind of eye-opening to what's out there, and have done some watershed-wide tours just to identify areas that might be potential sites for a habitat restoration project. And I guess like working in fisheries, it's just kind of become a natural thing because I come from a family of fishermen. I grew up with all my uncles, my great uncles, always sharing their stories about salmon and the importance of salmon to our people. And it kind of just, I feel like I just seamlessly ended up working in fisheries. It happened just so organically, and then I went to school at VIU in Nanaimo, and now I'm in school at UNVC. So I'm not really sure what the future holds for me after I'm done my master's, but I hope that I can go back to my nation and serve them in their fisheries management.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. I will now pass it over to Casey.
Quinn, everybody. Hi, I'm Casey. I'm Unklakafmach Mi'kmaq Métis and Acadian. And I've titled my presentation here with an Unklakafmach word that I have learned, as many of us do, later on, not in childhood, as would have been so nice to have done. But this is Mishtenj. It means to try to do or learn something, which is really what I try to keep in mind throughout the work that I do, is just to keep good intentions and really try and focus on learning from the people, especially the host nations that have hosted me throughout my education down here in the Lower Mainland, and to try and do good work for them and with them. Let's see, there we go. My first slide here is about relationality, because as Indigenous professionals, it's really easy to lose that sense of our positionality, who we are, and unfortunately some of the words seem to be a little bit broken up on the slide, but these are a bunch of things that I currently am. I'm Unklakafmach. I'm a molecular biologist, an auntie recently, and I am a master's student too, and at the moment that is where it takes up a lot of my time. But it's important as Indigenous professionals and grad students not to lose our sense of positionality, because it allows us to do better, more holistic, more honest work, and it's really important to keep hold of that. So, as I mentioned, I am a biochemist, and I'm not sure where the slides went, but there were some pictures on there, thank you. There were some pictures on there of me doing some genetics work in Dr. Nancy Hawkins's C. elegans lab at Simon Fraser University, where I did my undergrad. It's actually kind of hard to find pictures with a lab coat because one of our lesser known secrets in biochem is that if you don't always wear the lab coat, so it's really hard to find a sciencey looking picture. But the reason I think that I really went into science is because I was a very curious, stubborn kid, and specifically fisheries because of the fact that I grew up fishing. These are pictures of me with my dad fishing as a kid all around Williams Lake. He looked very young at the time and still does, but these are some really critical moments where I learned about the importance of fish in my family, but also in my nations, in our cultures, in our lives, and it was something that was a staple year-round. As you can see the right side picture here, I'm ice fishing with my grandpa. Fish were important to us at every season, and coupled with the fact that I was just too curious and stubborn not to be a researcher, I just went into researching fish and fisheries. And so it leads me to some of the methodology that I try to keep as an Indigenous scientist. And working with nations, you definitely can't work alongside the traditional Western science framework. And so in this figure that I've put together, it's not linear. It doesn't just start and end and that's it. Everything's neat as the way that it's often done in academia, but it is cyclical. And if you're doing good work, each next project builds upon the work that you've done before. So it often starts with, see if it comes up, there you go, some funding and planning that really needs to be done with the partner nations that you're working with. And in my specific master's project, we are working with the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund to co-develop a culturally relevant framework for watershed health assessment with Lower Fraser First Nations. And a lot of this project planning was done by the FNFLF and by the nations in advance of my ever knowing about the project. And so this was really an important project for the nations, which helps a lot with the next step of all of this, which is the relationship building. There's a history of researchers coming in and doing what's often referred to as helicopter research, where you go in, you think you know what you know better than the people that you're working with, and you do your research project and you leave, and the community never hears from you again. But that really is unethical research that it needs to be stopped, but that's a whole process in and of itself. And in trying to do ethical research, relationship building really is a huge part of it. It's made easier when the projects that, like the one that I'm working on here, were initially developed and brought about by the nations to an academic institution, and we're really just lending our skills to the nations in developing this project. So in the moment, I am in the middle of sort of a data collection and knowledge exchange period. This weekend, I'm actually going to go out and take some of my first samples, which I'm really excited about. And all of this is in partnership with the nations and with the FNFLF that we work with. And it's really an exciting process, but it does take longer to work with nations. It's a whole lot more, work, but it is more rewarding, and you get better research and better data that comes out of it. Throughout this whole process, we've been holding community workshops, and we're about to hold another one in our specific project at the end of the month, because that's so important when you're working with nations to report back to community, not just at the end, although there may be some communities who only want to have one report at the end of a project, but to report back at every stage, especially when you are working with larger organizations, to make sure that all of our goals are we're on the same track, we have the same end goals in mind. And throughout this project also, and through the process, co-authorships and benefit sharing are a huge part. Whether that be traditional Western scientific publications or community reports, multimedia publications, it's crucial and it's critical to be co-authoring these with the nation partners that we work with. here I have a picture of early in September. On the left, Kate Mussett, another master's student in the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, myself in the middle, and then on the right, Dr. Andrea Reid, our supervisor. This is our very first field day. And I just put this here to sort of demonstrate that the work that we do is in service to the nations that we work with. These sites that we're doing our field work on, we didn't choose them. We held cultural mapping sessions, and communities that we work with identified sites of concern or of cultural importance. And we really had nations took the lead on this, and we are just following with what they have told us were the most important places to look into. And we're really trying to be as holistic and as focused as we can be on the land. My specific project, I'll just quickly go over, is an environmental DNA-based assessment of watershed health. So I'm bringing together some of my biochemistry training background, love being in the lab. So we're going to go and collect diatoms, which are an algal species. They're great indicators of different environmental changes, which may be pollution, temperature changes, pH changes. And we're hoping to incorporate this in the framework to have a better, faster way of assessing watershed health that nations can use to increase their own agency in stewarding their own lands. So, Kukstem, Walalan, thank you, merci, for listening. And this, thank you so much.
Thank you, Casey. And I'll pass it over to Latia, the final panelist.
Tanse kakiao Latia Northwest Natsigasun, Nipsikupa Kochinia, Maga Megwach Miskuchiwaskaikni Kewigian, Nehia Skonia, Egua Nistanao Neosap, and Tatu Pipunan. Hello, everybody. My name is Latia Northwest. I'm here from Salmon Cree Nation. I'm 24 years old, and I am currently completing a Bachelor of Science in Environmental and Conservation Science with Native Studies at the University of Alberta. I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about my experience with my community's water committee that I've been a part of since 2020 and my role here as a youth representative. So Salmon Cree Nation's NIPI committee, NIPI meaning Water in the Plains Cree language, was mandated in 2013 through our governance structures push for our own sovereign water management systems. That's apart from provincial government's prescriptive authority. So this is a grassroots organization that is unique in that it utilizes community members and elders' traditional knowledge in the decision-making processes for enhancing and protecting our own water resources. In creating these long-term and sustainable solutions, we've developed a water plan that has goals for access to clean and safe drinking water for future generations, as well as initiatives for conservation and protection, and overall just creating a capacity to manage our own water supplies. And then in 2016, a water law was created in Samson that had help from elders that was inclusive of treaty, Indigenous sovereignty, natural law, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So a lot of work that we've done and are doing right now is working on issues that we're currently facing in terms of boil water advisories and lack of critical infrastructure like treatment plants and wastewater management facilities, to ensure that community members have access to clean, safe drinking water. Our chair, Mario Swampy, says that we have to go back and fix these issues before moving on. Our chair, he says that we have to go back and fix these issues before moving on to create these long-term sustainable solutions and not just Band-Aid solutions that have historically been prescribed to us by colonial governments. And it's not just technical fixes that we're looking to achieve here. When it comes to water, it's a complex and multi-dimensional issue that requires not only just a single agency. So there's a strong desire to focus on the social aspect of management here. So that was just like a bit of background about the NIPI committee. But as a youth representative, I attend meetings alongside a handful of community members and provide feedback about in discussions about projects, future collaboration, and decision-making. I have a strong role here as a youth voice because in today's day and age, the perspectives from youth are becoming more important moving into the future when water resources will soon become even more dire with the ongoing effects of climate change. And I believe youth are a critical age group in this equation who can offer new ideas in water management. Sorry, I'll get to wetlands in a bit, in water management. So we always hear, youth are our future. which is so true. Like, it's important to always be thinking about our future generations, but it's also important to note that the youth are also our present. So this political restructuring that involves creating space for the younger generation creates so much potential for empowerment. And the committee encourages me to help with this and challenges me to think critically and use the energy that I have in an efficient manner when conducting research on government policies and bills that we know are going to impact us as a community. And the most valuable part for me working on this committee is that transmission of intergenerational knowledge that I'm able to receive when attending meetings with elders. So I'm able to hear their perspectives and concerns, which then just kind of informs my own work in this way. So at the beginning of my term with the NIPB committee, I was tasked to sit alongside a longstanding NIPB member to work with the Alberta Water Council in reviewing the Alberta wetland policy, just to make for clear implementation goals, because previous versions of this policy were too broad and in need of better specification and direction. So here we participated in surveys to identify key themes in wetland management that were inclusive of Indigenous perspectives, to strengthen and foster confidence in policy implementation, just for an overall goal of promoting wetland stewardship. So the Alberta Wetland Policy Review Report, it's like a mouthful, it was released this past June in the summer, and this was like the first major hands-on project that I was able to help accomplish in collaboration with government. I'm super proud to have been a part of. So while working on projects like this and shadowing other community members, I'm able to gain these valuable experience, skills, and knowledge needed to advocate for my community's needs and promote social change. So in conclusion, like, the last thing that I want to say is that this decentralization of natural resource management towards communities, it just has a number of benefits. So the first kind of being is that it includes, one second. It includes community participation, just to better engage citizens on matters affecting their livelihoods, and just opens up the opportunity for citizens to create a future based on their own terms. So people who live and dwell, work in these areas are found to be better equipped to collect data information just because they're so familiar with the natural environment around them, which ultimately improves management decisions. And how NIPB is able to be successful in this way is that we're inclusive of Indigenous law into all aspects of our work. Because of our community's governance structures, we have the ability to act in a self-determining way. And we also have a diverse community a part of our committee, so we work with academia, watershed alliances, and neighboring communities, which is like super important because these treaty relationships, we need to be respectful of those because water issues can't just be solved by a single agency. And since we are all treaty people, we always need to be working together to solve these water issues for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the waters flow. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Latia. And thank you, Caitlin and Casey and Latia, for being here with us today and for the work that you're doing to protect our water and aquatic ecosystems. We hope to continue this conversation with each of you and with other youth within our organization. And we also want to recognize the special responsibility that Indigenous women have to speak for and care for our water. And want to thank all of these amazing women for sharing their women-led initiatives. So thank you. I'll pass it over to Michelle for some questions.
Hi, thank you, panelists, for the discussion. Please, if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, type them into the Slido box, and panelists will be happy to answer them. All right, so we have about 5 questions already on the board. What are better recruiting strategies compared to old school type of job posting to connect First Nations organizations with upcoming youth biologists? Who wants to take a stab at that?
I think half the battle is just knowing what Indigenous youth biologists are interested in. The traditional projects, I think, that academia or other organizations bring to Indigenous youth might not be the projects that Indigenous youth are interested in. And they often are not. So half the battle is just listening to what we need and what we want and what we see as what needs to be happening and what we want to work on.
That is so exciting. I'm going to go through a few of these questions so I can try and maybe get every one of you to answer one. I do see we have a statement. It is heartwarming to see passionate youth, young women involved in nature, water, and fish. What has helped you go this direction with your life and career? There you go.
Yeah, so kind of what led me to this direction in my career is just my love of the ocean and the river and just being, I think for me, the one thing that connects me to my culture is Ulican is probably the biggest, but also salmon and just how important it is to, just that connection of everything. And I think, even in my time, I've seen salmon stocks go down and like being a part of research and being involved with, further understanding of salmon and, hopefully leading the way in the future that, I want my kids to have salmon and I want my kids to have Ulican. So like figuring out what's happening now, I think is super important. It'd be a lot nicer if government would act faster and we, got on with tackling climate change so we can all ensure that we have a fisheries in the future.
Awesome. Okay, I've got a couple statements and I think you guys need to hear these. Incessant gloom has finally been broken by these bright young achievers. My heart soars knowing our future can be defined by such as these. Never fails, youth panel steals the show again. So, we do have a question, and I guess I will go to Latia? Is that how you say it? Latia. Do you have any advice for other Indigenous youth looking to work on water and fisheries related projects?
I think my most important advice here is to, I'm always promote advertising for youth to look for opportunities of mentorship along their journeys. So if there's any way you can find opportunities to get into the water industry at all, or if you know people who are already working on water projects, I would just go up to them and ask them if you could like shadow with them or work alongside them or ask them for advice. That's what I've always done growing up, is just straight up ask people I know are working in these areas. This is the best way, I think, in terms of networking. For me, this is exactly how I got into it. Do any of you guys have anything to say?
Okay, next question I have is, have you ever experienced barriers to entering into research or academia as Indigenous people?
There's not enough time on this panel to talk about that. Yeah, there's a story that I tell all the time when even halfway into my undergrad, I was looking into starting a master's, and no matter who I contacted, except for Andrea Reid, who's now my supervisor, when I would explain what my interests were, I would always get the question, without fail, well, what do you want to do, the social science or the science? And they are not separable. When you're looking into how things work and the questions that traditional Western science usually focuses on, you can't separate human impact and humans from the system. We are part of the system. So to think that Western science and social science aren't the same thing and they don't work together is a huge barrier that it took me honestly years to find someone who understood.
Awesome. Okay, questions are rolling in here. So I will go to Caitlin. What about strategies to get more youth working in the glory of fisheries?
Yeah, I think something that I've done as the youth in my community is just asking them like what are your future plans, and like asking them what their connection is to salmon and ocean resources. And a lot of my younger cousins and nieces, I've been like, please, become a scientist, and these are the courses that you need to take. But also sharing my experiences, sharing my work experiences and why it's so rewarding. And I think it's just, everybody who works in fisheries, I think, should take the initiative to talk to some youth or go into high schools to really, talk about fisheries, especially in First Nations fisheries, because I think that's, I think we need more Indigenous scientists. So it's how do we get to the youth? But yeah, it's just taking the initiative to talk to the younger generation.
Awesome. I'm going to go to Lataya, what do you feel are the best ways to foster interest in science and fisheries management among Indigenous youth?
I think a lot of Indigenous youth are already interested in these aspects of it because well, not just me, but younger people too are experiencing these issues that are happening with our water systems and fisheries as well. So I feel like there is already an interest there. It's just the matter of creating, like programs for youth to begin getting into these areas. Like Indigenous youth are natural scientists in these ways already. So just being able to have these programs already in place for youth is the best way, I think, to foster even more interest in this.
Excellent. Okay. Caitlin, can you elaborate a bit further on the relationship between the Pacific salmon ulukins? How can the conservation of one fish species support the efforts of another species?
Yeah, so ulukin are definitely one of those species that's a prey item. So when Chinook are migrating down south in the winter, like the winter Chinooks, they're feeding on ulukin as they run into the Skeena watershed. Also, ulukin larvae is a big factor in juvenile salmon survival. So I think in the interconnected food web, I don't think it's well understood how important ulukin is, but I know there are signs of how important ulukin are to every other, to Pacific salmon. And then thinking about management of ulukin, ulukin is a First Nations only fishery in BC, so I think that managing ulukin should be done from an Indigenous approach and an Indigenous perspective, and I know that a lot of the knowledge from ulukin has come from Indigenous knowledge holders along the coast because ulukin weren't studied until about the mid-90s when there was a big decline. And then I think, so the research project I'm working on with Karut in the Haisla territory, it's all Haisla based and Haisla driven, so it's a really amazing and unique opportunity to see a nation being able to manage a resource that is strictly theirs. But also, what I would love to see is when we manage salmon fisheries is to bring traditional knowledge in, and I'd bring traditional knowledge into management and traditional management systems. I don't think it could happen that traditional knowledge fits into the realm of the colonial structures, but they just need to be seen as equal, but I don't think that they're the same. They're not the same at all. They don't fit into the same paradigm. So it's, one is not over the other, but as Kimbaya was saying earlier today when we were talking, is that the boats need to go together.
All right, I have one last question. Jenna and Kimbaya, thank you for the fantastic panel of inspiring people. Are you considering convening Indigenous youth and fisheries in the future? I work with spectacular young people, and I think they would thrive engaging with others. Coming from Michelle Tung.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start and then I'll pass it over to Kim if she has anything else to add. It's funny because when we were organizing this panel, we were discussing this, and I think the FNFC has seen major growth over the past year. We have more capacity, and I think that we would love to convene Indigenous youth in the future. I think that is super important moving forward. I think it's just a matter of when, but I will pass it over to Kim.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely think the FNFC is interested in it. I've heard multiple communities at multiple meetings. I know this is also something that I'm quite interested in, creating a space for youth to be more involved in the work. So it's, to me, just ensuring that we are strategic about it and that the work that youth will be doing with us will be meaningful. We don't just want to integrate them anywhere. We need to ensure that it's done in the best way possible.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for taking an interest in STEM, because as a long-toothed academic, it is so important to see you excel in the areas of science and math, and I want to continue to encourage youth and children to carry on those endeavors, because that will make the changes that we need to be able to create the salmon parks for the future. And I hope you guys were watching yesterday and got to see the Nuchalnath presentation on salmon parks. And if you haven't, please watch that, because I want you guys to be the ones implementing that new idea. All right, thank you to the panel for the wonderful discussion, and thank you for making time to attend the First Nations Fisheries Council Fall Assembly 2021. We hope that the discussions we have had today were interesting and will continue to advance the good work we will do together. We'll now hear the concluding remarks from Hugh Breaker, the Council President for the First Nations Fisheries Council. So with that, thank you everyone for 2021 Fall Assembly. Over to you, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Well, over the past 3 days, we've heard a wealth of presentations and panels, ending with a spectacular panel from the youth, and especially spectacular because it was a group of young women who have taken a life-changing interest in fisheries management, and oceans. But over the past 3 days, we've had a wealth of information come to us on a whole host of issues. Only some of the issues that we are facing over the next few years. It's not possible for us to address every single issue that we face in our fall assembly. Just yesterday, I picked up a book and started to read about invasive species in British Columbia and the damage that these invasive species are going to do to our water and our water resources. So there are other issues yet that we still have to tackle, and we still have to turn our minds to at future assemblies. We have given you a great opportunity over the past 3 days to listen to the presentations, to inform yourself about some initiatives, not that we tried to teach or inform you about each issue in an overwhelming way or in a full way. No, we tried to give you an indication, at least, of some of the main points that each of these issues face. Now, we'd like something from you. We'd like your feedback. This assembly had to be held online because of the ongoing COVID problems in British Columbia. We know that the numbers in the far north of the province, when I say far north, I mean north of Prince George, in the north of the province, are really rather dismal. The COVID numbers are not really going down there, and it's starting to go up in some other places too. So unfortunately, we had to have this fall assembly online. We hope that next year's assembly will be an opportunity for us to meet in person, and hopefully this COVID pandemic will be behind us. But we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear your opinion on how this assembly went. Whether or not you thought the topics that we covered were good, and whether or not you have any ideas about future assemblies and where you'd like to see us go. Or maybe you'd like to see us miss some things and include something else. Please let us know. You can always reach us by email. You can always reach us by telephone. You can just jot a note down and text it to me if you want, to my cell phone. We're always ready to listen. So we ask you to please give us some feedback on our assembly and let us know how we're doing. When I started the assembly 2 days ago, I mentioned the Global Climate Change Conference, which is ongoing in Glasgow, Scotland. Since that time, since 2 days ago, a report has come out by a nonprofit group, a very respected group in Europe, in which they are predicting that actually the commitments being made at the climate change conference are falling short. And in fact, they are predicting that the temperature is going to rise by 2.4 degrees, which is far beyond the threshold that we need to prevent catastrophe. Well, this just encourages the pressure on us to make our voices louder and to bring government to the table with us so that they know that First Nations people stand to suffer the most from some of these problems that climate change brings. We need to let the government know that. I think that the topics that we face today are just going to get more and more complicated as time goes by. They're going to get more and more complex and difficult for us to deal with. And the First Nations Fisheries Council is going to need your voice in dealing with those complex and complicated problems in order that we can get our voice heard by government. So again, I encourage you, as I did on the first day, to help the FNFC by having your voice heard, attend those workshops and conferences that are held, read some of our publications, give us a call. I meet with the people I represent, the Nuu-chah-nulth Council of Hatwe, every time they meet, and listen to the issues that they raise. And I'm sure that all the rest of you can raise your issues at your regional meetings too. So in closing, I want to thank all the staff who have helped to make this conference possible. It's a big, complicated thing to do, to organize a huge online conference like this where everybody is sitting in different locations. And it's all done through media and internet. So thank you to all the staff who helped put this together. I thought it went very well. There were a few little glitches here and there, but we dealt with those. Those are to be expected with this kind of an assembly. And thank you to the moderator. And thank you to especially all those who presented in panels or on their own during this assembly. We really appreciate the participation of everybody who presented a paper or did a presentation during the assembly. Thank you to all those people especially. Have a good weekend, and thank you all for tuning in for the past 3 days. Thank you, Michelle.